Is the mic, can everybody hear the mic? Okay, good. I'm very happy to be here, especially because of the gorgeous view. You are very, very lucky to be attending such a beautiful university. And such a beautiful day. Well, today I'm going to be talking to you about the Dead Sea Scrolls, sort of a general overview of what they can teach us about the text of the Old Testament and about early Judaism. And my assistant here will be advancing the slides, so go to the first one. The Dead Sea Scrolls have been called by many one of the most important archaeological finds of the 20th century. And they were an extremely important find, Dead Sea Scrolls, because they were found in the Judean desert around the Dead Sea. And next, in caves, which at the time of their find were not quite this obvious. In fact, one of the sort of ironic aspects of the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls is very few of the scrolls were actually found by archaeologists. Most were found by Bedouin, who would sort of swirl into all the caves they could in order to find any kind of artifact or treasure. And while the archaeologists were doing their excavations at what's called Khirbet Qumran, which is the ruins that you see in the left-hand picture, somebody said, well, maybe there are some more caves around here. Maybe we could find some more manuscripts, because by this time, some of the manuscripts had been found in caves 1 through 3. And the archaeologist said, oh, there aren't any caves around here. And just below the plateau, in the rocks to your right, there were indeed more caves with more manuscripts. The finds amount to representatives of about 900 manuscripts. Now, that's a little misleading, and so is the word scroll, because very few of them were intact. And I sometimes, when I talk to people about what it was like to find and try to decipher these scrolls, is imagine that somebody gives you 900 crossword puzzles, but only takes a few pieces out of each puzzle, puts them in a big bin, and shakes them all up. And then you have to figure out which puzzle pieces go to which puzzles, and none of them are complete. That was the task that the scholars had in the years following the initial discovery of the scrolls in 1947. Next. To sort of set this in the context of dates, nobody likes dates, but to sort of give you an idea, for those of you who may not know exactly when the scrolls date to, is the community at Qumran basically lived at that plateau where the ruins were from about 200 BCE to the first Jewish revolt, about 68 CE. And during that time, the Jews were under domination from the Greeks, from the Seleucids, and then there was the Maccabean revolt, which many people think may have been the sort of catalyst for people to move out into this community at Qumran. Roman conquest happened in about 63 BCE. The Herod, look at old King Herod, rules from about 37 to 4 BCE. Pontius Pilate rules from about 26 to 36, crucifixion of Jesus in 30, and the first Jewish revolt begins in about the year 66. So the Dead Sea Scrolls sort of date across this period today, and I could probably give you a full semester of information, but you don't want to sit here for that whole time. So I'm going to focus on three major questions about what the Dead Sea Scrolls can teach us. One has to do with the question of what we call the Old Testament canon. What books were considered authoritative and sacred at Qumran, and how does that relate to the larger question of when did the Jewish canon, or the extent of the books of what Christians call the Old Testament, when was that limited? When did that close so that no more books were added? The other question is, what do the scrolls tell us about some of the variants that we find between ancient copies of the Bible? And the third question is, what do the scrolls tell us about early Judaism, Judaism of this Second Temple period? Okay. So let's begin. And the first question has to do, next, the formation of the Old Testament canon. When were the books of the Old Testament considered sacred, and when was the canon closed? And a lot of this information is very difficult to discern. We have a general idea. Go ahead. We kind of know that for the Jews, the Torah was probably considered sacred quite early. That is the central text of Judaism, is Torah. Genesis through Deuteronomy. Certainly, sort of during the exilic period, there is a strong sense of its authority, if not earlier. They don't really, there's no really document that says, we decided these books. It's a much messier process. We also know that that by the time of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the prophets were considered sacred and to have a lot of authority. But the question is, those books which are considered by Jews the writings, Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, there was a lot of uncertainty in scholarly circles about, well, when were these books considered sacred? When did they stop adding new books? And there was great hope that clues of some kind would be found among the Dead Sea Scrolls that would give everybody an idea of when exactly did the Hebrew Bible take shape in its current form. Next. Now there were some clues among the finds. Before I get to that, before the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, we didn't really have any really ancient texts of the Old Testament, of the Hebrew Bible. We had medieval Hebrew Bibles, Hebrew codices, that maybe at the earliest dated 6th, 7th century, 8th century, in incomplete form. We had earlier texts in Greek. These are preserved because they were used by a lot of churches. The Greek translations, which themselves date back to probably the 3rd century BCE, but most of the copies we have are much later. We have some Bibles from the 3rd and 4th century of this Greek translation, and those are our major witnesses until the Dead Sea Scrolls come along. Next. And for the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis through Deuteronomy, we have the Samaritan Pentateuch. The Samaritan community only considered Genesis Now, so what kinds of manuscripts were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls? Probably about a third of them were what were biblical texts. And very highly represented were Torah, Genesis, and this particular manuscript actually has the very beginning. In the beginning, God created. Bereshit bara. Next. Exodus, Leviticus. Next. This one's a little bit easier to read. You can all read that, right? They're teaching you to read Paleo-Hebrew. Next. Numbers. Okay. Next. Deuteronomy. Okay. All of these are very well represented among the texts in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And there will be a quiz later. You can come up and read from me. Next. There are also a lot of prophetic books. Now, Joshua in the Jewish Bible is considered part of the prophets, not in the Christian Bible. But you have a lot of prophets. So you have manuscripts like Joshua. Next. Samuel. Samuel is very well represented. Next. The only real, pretty much complete scroll was a book of Isaiah. And that may be missing just like a little bit of one page. It's pretty complete. It was one of the first ones that came to light. It's pretty phenomenal text. It's one of the few that really qualifies to be called a scroll. Everything else is what we call fragments. Next. Within what would be in Jewish canon would be called the writings, the Psalms are extremely well represented, more than any other book of the Bible. But Psalms would probably have a double function. They would probably be, biblical text, but they would also be part of the liturgy, part of worship. Next. Books like Job. This one is an Aramaic translation, and that's kind of a clue, at least in my own mind, that it would have been considered a very important book. It would have been considered probably canonical because you take the time to translate something into Aramaic from Hebrew, which was a process that was started within the Jewish community. We don't really know when, but a lot of people would not necessarily have spoken Hebrew. So very often the Hebrew text was translated into Aramaic so more people could understand it. And we have this copy of Job from Qumran. Ecclesiastes or Kohelet is there. Next. Daniel, there's a surprising number of texts of Daniel. Seems to have been a very popular book, at least from what we can tell by what remains of manuscripts at Qumran. Next. Now this one, the Nehemiah fragment, up until a few years ago, they thought, Nehemiah wasn't found at Qumran. But Ezra was. And in ancient times, Ezra and Nehemiah formed one book. So, okay, we can consider probably Nehemiah. The last few years, all these little fragments have been sort of popping into view, mainly coming from a collector called Kondo, the son of the original Kondo, through whom the Bedouins sold most of the Dead Sea Scrolls that came to the attention of the world. And his son William has, in the last few years, been selling off some of the fragments that the family Jewish canon, the books that are represented are pretty much everything that is in the current Jewish Bible, except for Esther. Nobody's found anything from Esther. What I wanted to show you too, and it's kind of an interesting observation, that the sort of three top, most popular, the three greatest hits, you might say, of Qumran are Deuteronomy, Isaiah, and Psalms. And interestingly, if you look at the New Testament and what is quoted there, the three greatest hits are Deuteronomy, Isaiah, and Psalms. Now, what's interesting is that both communities did very, very different things, or had very different understandings of their religious life and faith as a whole. But they seem to have emphasized basically the same books of the Bible. Next. But one of the confusing things is that we can say, okay, they basically, at Qumran, have the same Bible that became standardized in wider Judaism. Except there are little complications. For example, there are a lot of copies of a book called Enoch, or the Book of Giants, which is related to it, which is basically seems to be the character Enoch in the Bible, various visions. It's sort of a retelling of the story of the Nephilim that are mentioned before the flood in Genesis, the giants, the whatever they are, in Genesis 1 through 6, when it talks about how the sons of God married the sons of men in Genesis 1 through 6. 1 through 6. Another book that is very popular is called Jubilees. And Jubilees is kind of like a retelling and a further development of the law based on Genesis through the time when Moses is on Mount Sinai being given the law by God. Now, these two books are not considered part of the Bible generally in either Judaism or Christianity, except for the Ethiopic Church. And in the Ethiopic Church, these are both parts of the Bible. So the question is raised. Were these just really popular texts, or were they part of the Qumran Bible? And we don't know. Next. Now, another thing that kind of can tell you what books did they consider sacred has to do with what books do they quote when they are trying to make a point. What authorities are they drawing from? And you have things like this particular manuscript called Testimonia, which quotes Numbers, Deuteronomy, and Joshua. So that's kind of a clue. They consider these authoritative books. Next. Another one is, what books do they write commentaries on? And we find a number of commentaries on prophetic books. Now, these aren't commentaries like you would find in your library. Go to the next one. Here's another one. It's a commentary on Isaiah. Go to the next one. These are more what you might call application. They're not trying to figure out what did the author of Isaiah mean in his own time and context, but rather, how do we apply what the prophet said in our own time? How does it relate to what's going on right now in our community? And so, for example, here they quote from Isaiah 5, exiled. Without true knowledge, the masses go hungry, the throngs are parched with thirst. And then the interpretation of that is, these are the men of mockery who are in Jerusalem. So they're taking a prophetic text and applying it to their own situation. And that's what their commentaries or peshers are. But it tells you, Isaiah is important enough that we want to figure out what it has to say to us in our own life situation. So it's another clue about what is part of their canon or Bible. But before we move on to the next one, while one may have hoped that the Dead Sea Scrolls would have cleared up what books did Qumran think was authoritative, and when did the sort of canon reach its limits, it really just, in a sense, made things more messy. And we're going to find in the next section that it made things more messy here too. The lesson being that finding things from the past doesn't always answer all your questions, often it raises new questions. So, as I mentioned before, among the witnesses to the Bible before the finding of the Dead Sea Scrolls, there are some differences. Substantially, they're the same, but there are sort of different things between them. For example, in the Greek translations of the book of Jeremiah, the order is different, and the Greek version is about 1/8 shorter. So the question is, or was, did the translators change it? Or were they working from a different Hebrew original than what appeared in later Bibles? And we're going to find that that's messy too. Next. Because what we found is there are, if you look at what we call the Masoretic text, anybody tell me what the Masoretic text is? Okay. If you look at a medieval Bible in Hebrew, and we photographed one in 1990. First of all, it's that Bible, that medieval copy, that all of the modern translations are based on. So if you open up any Bible, they are mostly working from a medieval Hebrew copy of it, with some exceptions, especially since the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. And because Hebrew was just consonants, there were a group of people called Masoretes who put little markings above and below the line of the consonant in order to give you vowels and accents and also tell you how to chant the text. So that's kind of a very simple version. If you look at just the consonants in those Bibles, you will find an awful lot of manuscripts at Qumran which are either identical or very close to Bibles that date from 1,000 years later. So that's pretty phenomenal to say that there was that close a copying over that long period of time. And that version that we call the Masoretic was the one that became authoritative for Judaism. Next. You have something like the Great Isaiah Scroll, which follows the text of those medieval Hebrew Bibles very, very closely, except its spelling is different. It's not that big a deal. you could look at two letters written by the same person, and the spelling would be different. Next. But I mentioned that Samaritan Pentateuch. There have been some texts, like this text of Numbers, or this new Deuteronomy fragment that came to light a few years ago, which seem to follow more closely what you find in a Samaritan text of the Bible. Next, and I want to talk about this one with from Deuteronomy, because if you look up in your Bible, Deuteronomy 27:4, it will say, you will set up these stones on Mount Ebal. There's Mount Ebal and there's Mount Gerizim. Around modern Nablus. And this later became sort of Samaritan territory in the New Testament when it talks about Jesus going into the Samaritan country. That's this area. The Samaritans thought that the altar, and they indeed had a temple on Mount Gerizim. So the altar for them was not Mount Ebal, but Mount Gerizim. And we found this fragment, which seems to be a Dead Sea Scroll fragment, which says the altar should have been on Mount Gerizim. And it's very controversial because that would not be the normal Jewish interpretation. So what is this fragment doing? Why does it say this? And it raises all sorts of messy questions, including some people who say that the fragment is fake. Next. I don't expect you to read all this, but I just wanted to show you that while you have a lot of texts at Qumran which follow or are pretty much identical with the Hebrew text that becomes normative in the Jewish community, you also have a number of texts which are more like the Greek translation. And so it would appear that those people who were translating the Bible into Greek weren't just, making things up, but rather they were following a different Hebrew example, which had transmitted the text differently, because there is a manuscript at Qumran which follows the shorter version of Jeremiah that you find in Greek. Okay. So again, the question of, and the hope had been, we have all these really ancient versions of the Bible. Now we'll find out which reading was original. It didn't work that way. And things just got messier. Next. Another thing that made it messier was you had a wonderful psalm scroll. As I said, psalms were very, very popular at Qumran. And it's a very beautiful, it's another one of those which you can really call a scroll. And except it's pretty much like the psalms you find in the Bible. And it's pretty much the psalms from about Psalm 100 on. Except the order's a little bit different. They add a few psalms. For example, Psalm 151. Anybody ever read Psalm 151? In your Bibles you have? Good. Okay. Psalm 151 appears in the Greek version of the Psalms. And it's basically about the boy David. And also there are some extra psalms. So this raised another question. Well, does that mean that their Bible adapting and rearranging and adding as sort of an early version of the prayer book, of a prayer book. Or maybe it wasn't a sacred scroll, maybe it was a study version. All of these have been suggested. So, again, the past doesn't always answer every question. Sometimes it raises new questions. Okay. So we could say that we've learned a lot about the text and canon of the Old Testament as it appears at Qumran, and new questions have been raised. And the situation looks a little bit messier, because one of the other things that becomes very clear is that not only do you have various biblical manuscripts that preserve what we could say was the Hebrew, Masoretic, Greek, and Samaritan versions, you also have some readings which are completely different and nobody had ever seen before. So, kind of messy there. Next. Last question. What do the Dead Sea Scrolls tell us about Judaism during the late Second Temple period? There was a tendency before the Dead Sea Scrolls to look back and, based on rabbinic Judaism, which is the kind of Judaism that most people are familiar with, to sort of look back and see that as the dominant form of Judaism in this period that we're talking about. It was called normative Judaism. We knew there were other groups like the Sadducees, etc., and other sort of obscure groups that had been mentioned. But what we learn from the Dead Sea Scrolls is that actually there was a lot more variety in ancient Judaism than anybody had understood. And there was a lot of ferment, a lot of discussion about how in this modern period should we be Jewish. And the Qumran community, from what we can tell, and I'm, in the interest of time, sort of oversimplifying this, but they sort of had one approach which was in agreement and in conflict with other groups within Judaism. Next. So, for example, we had kind of always known there were Jews who were called Hellenizers. These were people who adopted Greek culture. They were usually the upper classes, and they had left behind a lot of Jewish practice. There were the Sadducees, which are mentioned in the New Testament, and they tended to be the priestly families. There was some influence with the Greek environment. They accepted the biblical texts, primarily the Torah. They rejected what would be called the traditions of the fathers or the oral law. This is one of their main contentions with Pharisees. They used purity laws only in the context of the temple. They used a solar calendar. 300, it's actually 364 days of the year. The Pharisees, also appearing in the New Testament, were more lay people. They rejected Greek culture. They accepted both the Bible and their oral tradition. They would be more akin, although not entirely identical, with the rabbinic Judaism that became dominant after the destruction of the temple. They were very much into purity laws, into community, and they used the lunar calendar. Now, the people who lived at Qumran seem to have also been priestly, but they seem to have been very dissatisfied with what was going on in Jerusalem. They wanted to be a lot more pure than what they saw was happening at the temple. They had a very strict ritual purity, rejected both the Pharisees and Greek culture, used the biblical text. They were much more radical in their observance, and they used the solar and the lunar calendar in a very, very complex arrangement. So what did they believe? Go on to the next. This is called the Temple Scroll, another one of those that qualifies as a scroll, about 28 feet long. Next. And it's basically a retelling of Genesis, Exodus, and Deuteronomy. But they make things stricter. For example, in Deuteronomy, the king is not to have a lot of wives. Well, in the Temple Scroll, he's not only not supposed to have wives, he's supposed to have one wife, and she has to be from Israel. She can't be foreign. Next. This is from something called the Damascus document. So going back a minute, sorry. So the Temple Scroll is just one among many examples where they take the biblical text and they reinterpret it. They reinterpret it for their own time. So this one is called the Damascus document. Next. And here, one of the things we realize about the community is, like the early Christians, they saw themselves as being a community of the new covenant. This idea of a new covenant is very prominent in a lot of the writings. And they talk about going into the land of Damascus. We don't really know what that means. Maybe kind of an exile, a place where they can be more pure. Next. This here is another interpretation or commentary on the prophetic book. Next. And here what we find out is this whole idea that people have interpreted as a conflict with the main priestly community in Jerusalem. And there's a lot of reference to a teacher of righteousness, somebody who leads their community, and he's against what they call the man of the lie. So there's some kind of conflict going on where they are disagreeing and seeing themselves, separating themselves out from a community which they see as corrupt. Next. Another thing we see with this particular group, by the way, they're often identified with the Essenes. They call themselves the community. Next. In this one, they talk a lot about messiahs. So they are very messianic, like early Christianity and other groups within Judaism. Not so much Pharisees, I don't think. I could be wrong about that. But this group at Qumran is looking forward very soon to messiahs in the plural. Messiah, of course, Mashiach, simply means the anointed one in the Old Testament. And both kings and priests were anointed. So they're looking for a kingly Messiah, a priestly Messiah, and a prophet who will lead them into a new community. Next. The War Scroll is a little bit, it kind of reminds one a little bit of the book of Revelation, although not quite, but this end of time and the sort of establishing of the new kingdom of God, which will be everywhere next. And so, for example, you have the sons of light versus the sons of darkness. So this sort of apocalyptic, eschatological view, which you also find in some of the New Testament works. People had kind of thought that this was not common in Judaism at that time, but we find here's a group that follows it. Okay, and looks like I'm kind of running out of time because you have to be there at 5. And is there one more? Just go quickly. No, I won't even bother with this one. This one deserves a whole lecture by itself. This is the copper scroll. It is the scroll most likely to be voted as a movie, an Indiana Jones movie, or maybe a Lara Croft movie. It basically is a list of buried treasure, and nobody knows quite what to do with it. Okay, but you probably would have preferred to hear about this, right? Okay. If anybody's found the treasure, they're not. So, questions? Okay. So, questions.
You mentioned that the...
Nice and loud for everyone. Please stand up.
You mentioned in the area of the place where the found the Dead Sea Scrolls that people had identified themselves as a New Covenant people, and you talked briefly of going to Damascus. Is there any speculation which would suggest that these new people thought they were being given into a new land, just like the Israelites were given the land of Canaan?
It doesn't seem so. The question was, do they think they're being given a new land? It doesn't seem to be that so much as say in the War Scroll, there is the idea that the forces of darkness will be defeated and all the sort of existing land will be ruled by the sons of light. But it's not, but that reference to Damascus is very puzzling. Nobody really knows.
Do I have a quick follow-up? Did they actually get to Damascus?
Well, we don't know because we don't know what it means. We don't know if it's Syria. We don't know if it means the desert. Other questions? That's all right here.
Is this idea of canonicity, is it unfair to impose that upon the Essenes, and maybe is that even representative of the Jewish people at the time?
Well, it does seem to be representative of Judaism at the time, at least in terms of Torah, prophets, and probably Psalms. Because we have references, and if I'd had more time, I could show you there are references in Josephus, there are references in some of what are called the apocryphal or deuterocanonical books to the law, the prophets, and David.
Just the liberalization, though, the temple scroll itself shows something that it seems that in our contemporary view of canon would not be seen as something that you do with canon. That is, re-explain it, right, and expand on it.
But that does seem to be what very common in the ancient world. In other words, there is a lot of that at Qumran. But it is a question, why did they feel so free to rewrite it? At the same time, it's important or authoritative enough so that it seems to be quoted a lot, and it seems to be the basis of, throughout the manuscripts of anything they want to justify, they will appeal to those books. And it is those books mostly with that they will, especially Torah, it is those books which they will rewrite. So that shows you the importance of them. It's not maybe exactly how we would view canon, but it has authority, and that's a good question.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions?
I have another question if there's no
Yeah.
question. You talked about the big three, Psalms, Deuteronomy, and Isaiah. Couldn't it just be that those are the longest books, so of course we have the most quotes from them?
Well, you mean in the New Testament?
Both. You mentioned both.
The Qumran is not so much quotes, but examples of actual physical different manuscripts.
Again,
It could be an accident of what has lapsed.
so has anyone taken that? Has anyone done any analysis about the actual extent script that we have versus the amount of time, the amount of instances that they're cited?
Repeat that?
Yeah. I'll talk to you
Yeah.
afterwards.
I want to thank Dr. Lundburg for engaging in very helpful presentation of the skills.